A dominant seventh chord resolving down a perfect fifth is the most powerful harmonic gesture in music. We all know the sound. The ultimate resolution. Of course, it's also an extremely common and straightforward sound. I'm going to show you how to make this idea much more interesting. But first, we need to take a closer look at the chord itself. The dominant seventh chord occurs naturally on the fifth degree of a major scale. Structurally, it's a major triad plus a minor seventh. Now, this structure contains a very special interval. There are 6 semitones between the major third and the minor seventh of the chord. This is a powerfully dissonant interval known as the tritone. Think of the tritone as the backbone of the dominant seventh chord. This inherent dissonance is one of the reasons these chords usually sound like they really want to resolve, specifically to the chord a perfect fifth below them. The notes in G7's tritone, B and F, resolve perfectly to the C and the E in C major, the chord a perfect fifth below. Okay, here's where it gets interesting. Since tritones are exactly half of an octave, they are inversionally symmetrical. In other words, when you invert a tritone, you end up with the same tritone. If you think about it, this means any given tritone really exists in 2 different dominant seventh chords, and those chords would have to be a tritone away from each other. And since the tritone is such a big part of the function of these chords, we should have 2 different dominant seventh chords that both want to resolve to the same place. Welcome to tritone substitution. Okay, let's see. The dominant seventh chord a tritone away from G7 would be D flat 7. We just need to respell our B as a C flat, and we can see they do indeed share the same tritone, only inverted. What was originally the major third of G7 became the minor seventh of D flat 7, and vice versa. Okay, don't worry if you didn't quite follow all that logic. Here's the bottom line. If we want to target a certain chord, for example, C, we can do so using the dominant seventh chord a perfect fifth above it, which is G7, or we can use the dominant seventh chord a half step above it, D flat 7. In this case, D flat 7 would be a substitute dominant chord, or tritone sub. It does basically the same job as its more common counterpart, but in a more colorful way. By the way, we use these arrows to indicate dominant resolutions. A solid arrow for a dominant seventh chord resolving down a perfect fifth, and a dotted arrow for a dominant seventh chord resolving down a half step. So we can use a solid arrow or a dotted arrow to lead into almost any chord. Here's a progression that uses both types of dominant resolutions. Now that we have the basic concept down,
it's time to take it to the next level.
It's very common and effective for the 2 minor 7 chord to lead into the 5-7 chord. In this situation, 2 minor 7 is what's called a related 2 chord. That's a minor 7th chord leading down a perfect fifth into a dominant 7th chord. We analyze this relationship with a bracket. So we have a bracket leading into an arrow, and it sounds like this. But related 2 chords don't have to be the actual 2 chord in the key. We can use this bracket relationship to set up any dominant 7th chord. Let's see what happens when we add a related 2 chord to our sub 5-7. The minor 7th chord a perfect fifth above D flat 7 would be A flat minor 7, a very unexpected chord in the key of C major. So this chord will sound puzzling at first, but once you hear where it's going, it works really well. Now let's get weird. What if we take D flat 7's related 2 chord but swap G7 back in? Now we have a minor 7th chord leading down a half step into a dominant 7th chord. This is called a substitute related 2 chord, indicated by a dotted bracket. And how about a dotted bracket with a dotted arrow? You can even start chaining together and combining these brackets and arrows in all sorts of wild ways. The possibilities are endless. Here's a little example. Substitute dominants and related twos can give you some pretty far out sounds. But since these chords have such clear function to them, they tend to sound a little more palatable than you might expect given the amount of chromaticism involved. This is one of my go-to techniques if I'm looking for something interesting but not too difficult to listen to. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Also check out my Patreon page. The purpose of this channel is to offer free music education to the world, and your contributions make that possible.